Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 20th. And I still have that cold, unfortunately, but it's not COVID, so I am quite happy. And in terms of what we are going to be doing today, I wanted to begin some of the elements of the semester, but I'm well aware that people are still adding and dropping classes, and also we had a change over to Moodle. I noticed that not everybody, at least at the point of the recording of this video, has responded to our first discussion forum question, and you do need to do that, so please do so. And the first question was just merely an introduction of your introducing yourself to the class. And what I had talked about in my last video is that I will be posting a discussion forum question at the ending of each of my videos, and I will be posting these videos so that they are available to you by Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m. Though my hope is that I could get them available the night beforehand, but certainly by Tuesday, Thursday, 9 a.m. And then you would have 48 hours from either the Tuesday or the Thursday at 9 a.m. to respond to that discussion forum question. If it turns out that you need additional time, please ask me for an extension. You don't need to ask me for an extension for this first question that asks you to introduce yourself, because again, I realize that there are people who are still adding and dropping the class, and I hope that by next week, however, everything should be settled so that we can proceed forward. And what I did last class was I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. So if you have any questions at all about the syllabus or the course outline, which you can find in syllabus and other documents, please let me know. The expectations of the course are that you watch all of these videos that I post in their entirety. They basically duplicate what I would have discussed in a live class. That you answer the discussion forum questions, and that you read the responses of your classmates and my responses to all of you, because I will be responding to each of you. That would give you a sense of what we could do during a class discussion. And certainly you are encouraged to respond to your classmates in the discussion forum, but you're not required to. As long as you make a post in the discussion forum, you've satisfied the quote attendance unquote for that particular class. Of course, you need to do the readings in the textbook, and there is a copy of the book on reserve in the GCC library. And then finally, there are 3 formal graded speeches. The first being the autobiographical speech, which is going to be a 5-minute speech in which you basically introduce yourself to the class. So that's what we are going to be focusing on over the next several classes. But as the summer classes is very condensed, so it's not necessarily a bad idea for you to think about speech number 2, which is an informative speech asking you to teach the class something. That would be a 10-minute speech. And the way we will end the class is with a 15-minute persuasive speech, where you are going to try to convince the audience to either support a position or perhaps to take an action, perhaps both. I will be asking to have some contact with each of you prior to those 3 speeches. I call that practice. The contact can be as informal as an email exchange, or it could be something as elaborate as perhaps a Zoom meeting where you actually present your speech, if you wanted to, with me to get feedback. In the end, it's up to you as to how much or how little support you wanted in these practices, but I do want to make sure that we touch base for all of those speeches. And then finally, we've got 4 quizzes based on the textbook material. The quizzes will be 20 questions, mostly short answer, some multiple choice and true false, open book, open notes, and you have the option of dropping the lowest quiz grade, and those will be distributed throughout the semester. So that's a quick review of the class requirements, which we will talk about more in depth as they become applicable as the semester progresses. The one thing that I didn't talk about in terms of the syllabus is the section on plagiarism. And this used to be a fairly easy discussion, that plagiarism is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. As long as you acknowledge the source, then of course you are attributing credit to the author. Not doing so would be considered a kind of intellectual theft, whether it be a deliberate element or a mistake. But that ultimately you wanted to make it very clear to the reader that particular pieces of language or ideas that did not belong to you, you wanted to make sure the reader was aware of that, and the reader could find information about how and where to find those pieces of information in the source that you used. And in terms of plagiarism in today's world, as you know, artificial intelligence has exploded onto the scene. And I encourage you for multiple reasons just to stay away from artificial intelligence when it comes to your classwork, particularly in this particular class. And there are multiple reasons why. Certainly, there's the idea of doing your own work so that you have a learning experience, so that you don't need to rely on an outside source. There are also lots of questions about the ethics of artificial intelligence for our society as a whole, and the implications of artificial intelligence. So in just a few short months, we've moved from simple questions about using artificial intelligence and how that could be considered plagiarism to whether or not artificial intelligence could be or is self-aware, and what are the implications of that. And of course, artificial intelligence models grow through your use of them. So I would encourage you, particularly for this class, it's supposed to be a class in being able to verbally communicate, that you avoid the use of artificial intelligence. And as I always used to say when it came to plagiarism, as many online sources that existed to help students plagiarize, there were an equal number that helped teachers figure out if they were plagiarizing. Turnitin was one of my favorites, where I could type in a sentence or a paragraph and do a database search. And now there are all kinds of resources that are popping up too to try to determine if something is artificial intelligence. And again, I don't know where the artificial intelligence race is going to end, but I'm very hopeful that the skills in this particular class are skills that are more than just skills you're acquiring to satisfy a requirement or to earn a grade, but these are skills that you can transfer into your lives, both personally and professionally. So that's my little speech about artificial intelligence, except for a really funny story that I have to tell about plagiarism that I used to tell to try to encourage my students not to plagiarize. And actually, two stories. One actually occurred to me in the early days of my teaching career, pre-internet, believe it or not. And I was reading a group of papers, and I realized that one sounded familiar. Not that surprising, considering that teachers are pretty well read. It didn't take me long, though, to figure out where I read it before, because it was from our class textbook. Just about verbatim. As I'm fond of saying, you can't make these things up. With a few mechanical errors, I don't know if they were deliberate to try to throw me off the trail, or if they were just accidental because the person was a poor plagiarist. But the better story, and it is true, you can look it up in the academic newspapers. There are such things as academic newspapers, such as the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Turns out, around the same time period, pre-internet, there was a middle-aged professor. That point is important. He's reading papers, and a paper sounds familiar. And he's wondering to himself, where have I read this before? Where have I read? And it occurred to him, he hadn't read it. He had written it decades earlier as an undergraduate when he was a college student. It was one of his old papers. And yes, I know the chances, 1 in a million. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers from former fraternity members. But I always think of this story with a bit of a chuckle. Not that I encourage or support plagiarism, but I think I feel sorry for this student. The idea of not only being caught plagiarizing, and the consequences of being caught can be significant. You could be, if you're fortunate, just failed for the assignment. If you are not fortunate, you could be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. But at any rate, not only was the student caught plagiarizing, but he was basically plastered on all of these academic sites about the fact that he had submitted in his own professor's work. So I always used, and still use, those two stories as cautionary tales. So if you will see in the notes below, and I will always provide notes below these videos, and these are the notes that I'm actually using myself in terms of delivering these videos. One of the things we'll talk about is the importance of having good speaking notes, keywords, and phrases, so that if you get lost, you've got a guideline, but you want to maintain eye contact with either your audience or, in this instance, with the camera, because in effect, your camera is taking the place of the audience, which I know can feel a bit odd when you are first doing this, because most of us don't talk to cameras, or at least most of us haven't talked to cameras. But in our post-COVID world, it's becoming more and more common to do such a thing. So in the notes below, you can see that I've listed information about speech number 1, the autobiographical speech, which will be due on the 2nd of August, Tuesday. So we have some time to talk about that speech and some of the elements of public speaking, where you will give a 5-minute autobiographical speech telling the audience something about you and your life. You might elect to do a life overview, but if you do, obviously you're going to have to condense. You can't put decades worth of life into 5 minutes without condensing. Perhaps you wanted to focus on a particular element of your life, a time period, a hobby, for instance. Perhaps you might want to talk about education. It's the one thing that we all share. An educational goal, or your educational past, or maybe even the reason why you are taking this particular class. And your speech delivery, obviously you will be uploading that to Moodle. And what I will be doing is that I will be adding a place on our Moodle site for you to upload that speech. And your speaking outline, which we will be talking about, I will be asking you to send to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And that's how my grading program works best, is through email. And in the real world, you wouldn't necessarily even be showing your speaking outline to anybody, but I wanted to see your speaking outline just so that I could give you some feedback. And I'll be evaluating it informally on a checkmark system. But again, what you are looking at underneath the videos are my speaking notes, in effect, to give you an idea of how I construct notes. But we'll talk about this more in depth as we get further along in the semester. Now, I'm hopeful that you had a chance to read the readings that I had assigned for today, though again, I'm quite aware that you may not have been able to, as we are in the beginning of the semester. And you can always do these readings after the fact. That said, I wanted to talk about, as is listed in the 3rd section in our speaking notes, Toastmasters, something that was not listed in the textbook. I don't know if you've ever heard of Toastmasters. It's an international organization that helps members improve their public speaking skills. They are basically talking about giving toasts, about how oftentimes you have to present when you are, let's say, at a wedding or at a social function, and you're giving a toast to someone. So you want to become a master of that. In other words, public speaking skills are more than just skills that you would utilize in the workplace or utilize in school. You would also utilize them in social functions. So they basically formed an organization for individuals to develop their public speaking skills. And while individuals usually focus on public speaking and the delivery of speeches, it's just as important to serve as audience member to give feedback. And that's the trick. I mean, you could practice on your own, but you need an audience to give you feedback. And even in an online class, what we are going to have is an audience to give us feedback, because you will be watching the speeches of all of your peers and sending me feedback, and then I will be gathering all of that and presenting that to the class. So while you may not necessarily be an audience in person, you will be an audience technologically. So Toastmasters realized that in order for individuals to be able to practice their public speaking skills outside of an academic setting, what was necessary was to provide an audience. So these are individuals who volunteer to become part of this organization to help develop their public speaking skills. And they give speeches to one another and provide feedback to one another in a non-academic setting. And they actually came out with an instructional video about writing and delivering great speeches, which I was fortunate enough to find on YouTube. YouTube is a wonderful thing. It's approximately 25 minutes long or so. You'll see this in the 4th section of our notes. And I'm going to ask you to watch that video because it gives a good overview. In fact, what you might want to do is stop my video now and watch the Toastmasters video. And then you can go back to my video at approximately minute 16, because at minute 16 I will resume. Well, welcome back. I hope you had the opportunity to watch the Toastmasters video. As you can see, it was a good overview of some of the points we'll be talking about in the semester. The Toastmaster video talked about 3 different kinds of speeches: the informative speech, the persuasive speech, and the entertainment speech. And while you aren't giving an entertainment speech in this class, you are giving an autobiographical speech. And at least from my perspective, the autobiographical speech is quite entertaining. I find it quite interesting to learn about my students, and you may find it quite interesting to find out about your classmates. So I think of the autobiographical speech as being very similar to the entertainment speech, where you can oftentimes utilize stories and humor to engage an audience. The informative speech, which is the second speech we will be delivering this semester, that the Toastmasters video talked about the importance of being clear and concise, because you're basically teaching your audience something. And the persuasive speech, the way we will be ending this semester, that you oftentimes have to motivate your audience to either take an action or to support a position. And motivation includes addressing emotions, not just intellect. That said, I think that in some ways these 3 speech divisions are somewhat artificial, because I think they blend into all of them into one. The entertaining speech is also informative, if you are fortunate enough to be able to blend those 2 ideas together, as well as persuasive. If nothing else, your autobiographical speech is going to try to persuade us that whatever it is you're discussing has some importance in your life, some relevance. The informative speech, which is going to teach us something, will probably be entertaining, or hopefully it will be. It'll probably reference elements of yourself, autobiographical elements. And it'll probably be persuasive, if for nothing else, trying to convince us that the information you're sharing is important. And a persuasive speech has to be informative. You need to use information to convince somebody of something. And again, there's nothing wrong with the persuasive speech being entertaining. In fact, we hope for that. And certainly you might end up using references to yourself when you are giving a persuasive speech. Just dividing up the speeches into 3 elements so that we can focus on particular skills. I suppose the speech that would be most accurate would be my asking you to deliver, let's say, a 40-minute speech, and not giving you much direction outside of a broad topic. And you would utilize things like probably references to yourself, autobiographical, information, and also persuasion. And then, you would pick and choose how you would go about presenting that information. But no worries, you aren't delivering a 40-minute speech. Your first speech is 5 minutes, your second speech is 10, third speech is 15. So we're moving in increments. The video focused on practice, and I focus on practice, and not just the practice where I'm asking to meet with you or to at least have some sort of connection with you about your speech, But the more you practice your speech, even in front of your dog, the more comfortable you will become with the material. And most of giving a speech is all in the preparation, the things that you don't see. And to prepare for a speech, you want to think about things like logistics. Like, when are you delivering the speech? Where are you delivering the speech? How long should the speech be? Who your audience is? What the objective of the speech is? What research do you need to do, if any? And then actually beginning to construct the speech. In terms of the logistics, you already know the dates that your speeches are due. They'll be due at 11:59 p.m. on those dates that I've stated on our course outline. I'm asking you to post them onto Moodle. I'll have a space on Moodle for you to post them. And I'll be soon talking about probably the best way to go about doing that is through using YouTube. At least that's what IT recommends. And certainly that's what I do with the posting of these videos as well. So you want to make sure that you have some comfort with doing that, and that you don't wait until the very last minute to post a speech. If you've ever tried to upload something onto YouTube, sometimes there's a time lag. So certainly you want to try to take that into account. And then thinking about the audience, you already know your audience, your classmates and myself. And after everyone answers the attendance question, hopefully you'll know a little bit more about your classmates. The objective. And for you, the objective might be to deliver a successful speech. But for me, my objective is to give you the opportunity to practice some of the skills that the textbook will be introducing to us. And also just to give you some practice. And lastly, just so that we can get to know each other a little bit better. The objective goes into finally how you're going to go about presenting. And usually speeches are developed into 3 elements. And if you've taken a 101 class, then this probably sounds familiar. Introduction, body, conclusion. Or what the video calls introduction, discussion, and conclusion. You need to have a beginning where you've got a greeting, basically, and usually you're giving a thesis. You do want to greet your audience so that the audience is aware that you're about to begin. A discussion where you give your evidence and your details. And a conclusion where you offer a sense of closure and you say farewell to your audience. So, in terms of the presentation, which is how it's very different from 101 or from writing a paper, as you know, there are very formal academic guidelines to writing a paper. But when you're delivering a speech orally, then you want to do it in a way that's going to connect with your audience. So you want to be conversational. You don't want to be reading your speech word for word. You want to be able to maintain eye contact with the camera or the audience. You do that through a speaking outline where you've got an outline of keywords and phrases, not the text in its entirety, so that if you do forget your point, you could look down briefly if necessary. But basically, you want to try to have a conversation. And if you are well rehearsed and well practiced, you may not even need to refer to your outline. And the reality is, once you're delivering your speech, you don't necessarily have to follow your outline. The test is whether or not you've delivered a good speech. I kind of liken it to maybe following the GPS in your car. If you're going to a place you've never been to before, you probably should follow it. You can elect not to, but of course there's risk involved with that. So you definitely want to think about things like eye contact and body language, vocal inflections, pauses, and try to anticipate audience questions and address those questions in your speech, especially because you are going to be delivering online. So you may not necessarily have an audience present that can ask you questions. Though certainly an audience could, when they view your speech, ask you a question in the comment section. The idea is that you would respond to that to the best of your ability. And then you also have to think about some of the practicalities of filming. What is the lighting like where you are delivering your speech? We want to be able to see you. We want to be able to focus on your face. Certainly you can have partial or full body speeches. You can see I do a partial body here. But you want to make sure that we can focus on your facial expressions. You want to make sure that the background isn't too busy or too distracting. You want to make sure that your camera is steady. So there are those elements as well to consider, which we'll talk about in greater depth. So the textbook, what I had assigned for today, if you had an opportunity to read it, were the first 3 chapters. Chapter 1, Speech and Higher Education. Chapter 2, Getting Started. And Chapter 3, Critical Listening. So I wanted to talk about each in turn. Again, if you haven't had a chance to read these, you can read these chapters after the fact. But Chapter 1, Speech and Higher Ed, basically spends a lot of time trying to convince you that public speaking is an important skill for multiple reasons. Now, since this is a 101 class, it oftentimes introduces academic terms. So that's part of a 101, is that you are introduced to vocabulary of the discipline. An intellectual imperative, as you can see in section 6 in the notes below, is another way of saying that a well-educated individual usually has background and skills in certain areas, in languages, in mathematics, in sciences, and also in rhetoric and public speaking. In fact, if you are familiar with the early days of literature, they began basically as oral pieces. Some of the great epic poems, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, began as basically oral poems that fortunately were written down so that we could still access them in contemporary times. So that's just part of being a well-educated person, which is why public speaking or personal communication skills is oftentimes a requirement in colleges and academia. There is a social imperative, as I was referencing earlier, for human interaction, that we need to speak with one another. We speak with one another in the workplace. We speak with one another socially. There also is the consumer imperative, which I've become even more interested in as time has progressed. Our role as audience. In some ways, this is a difficult class to teach because I go through elements that are necessary to put together a good speech. You're evaluated on those elements, and then you listen to the speeches outside of class, and they don't follow those elements. Oftentimes, political speeches are great examples that don't follow the elements of being clear and being concise and being ethical, all of the things that you need to do. And oftentimes, these politicians are rewarded with power and money. And as I say, life isn't fair. And I also say that you should hold these individuals accountable if you have to hold yourself to these standards. And if you're holding your classmates to these standards, you should hold others to these standards as well. Now, public speaking is a circular kind of activity. There's a speaker who gives a message, obviously. You are the audience. You receive that message. And if we were speaking in a live situation, you would give feedback, and I would adjust accordingly, hopefully within reason. That would be ideal, so it would be circular. I know, again, that you can't see your audience, so that's an additional challenge. It certainly is for me as a teacher when I'm delivering a class. I can't read your expressions and your feedback, so to speak, to make adjustments. I can only guess. But again, as I had indicated, this is a skill that is just as important, being able to speak online or on video based on the way the technology has proceeded over the last several years. Ethos, an important term that we will talk about multiple times over the semester. If it sounds like ethics, it should, because it comes from that term about credibility. The idea that you want to be ethical in your speech. Your first speech comes with automatic ethos. The assumption is that you have expertise in your own life story. So you don't necessarily need to prove ethos in an autobiographical speech. You might need to in an informative or a persuasive speech. Chapter 2, Getting Started, because that's what you're doing now, basically, is that you are getting started, thinking about your autobiographical speech. But, of course, in the back of your mind, you have the informative and the persuasive. You need to select and narrow the topic. You do know that the topic is about yourself, and you have 5 minutes. But, again, how you go about that is up to you. I've had many students, again, who try to do a life overview of important points. That's fine. I've had many students who try to focus on a particular time period or element of their life, even an important person. But keep in mind that the speech is not about the person or the hobby. The speech is about how that person or hobby is important to you. If you feel uncomfortable speaking about yourself, you might want to talk about education, the one thing we all share, whether it be your educational past, your educational goals in the future, or why you are even taking this particular class. And then determining the purpose, as I had indicated, my purpose is to give you skills, or to give you the opportunity to practice some of the skills the textbook is discussing. And I also want you to get to know each other a little better. I want to get to know you a little bit better as well. Analyzing the audience and the occasion. And I have a story about this, and sometimes real life stories are a lot more powerful than any story you could find in a textbook. Happened to a colleague of mine, and at another community college, I won't give the school's name, she was also teaching public speaking. She had a student who was giving a speech on a very philosophical topic about being true to oneself. And as the speech progressed, the student began to remove articles of clothing. First shoes and socks and belt, then shirt, began to unbutton the pants. The teacher halted it right there and then and asked what exactly was going on. And the students said that they wanted to be as honest as they could with their audience. If this was a speech about being true to oneself, the student wanted the audience to see their true selves, or the student's true self. And the teacher stopped it right there and said, "We've seen enough of your true self. Thank you." True story. Might I suggest this student did not analyze the audience or the occasion, that this was not the time, nor was it the place to disrobe, which I believe, and so does this teacher, believes that the student would have done. Now, there is something to be said for shocking an audience, to try to get an audience's attention, but this is not the way to do it. So occasionally you might hear of a news story where a graduation speaker, underneath their cap and gown, they open up their gown and they're nude, and then the president of the college has to do some damage control. If you learn nothing else in this class, please don't disrobe. So analyzing what's appropriate for the audience and what's appropriate for the occasion. And of course, different audiences and different occasions require different things. You present yourself differently at a wedding than you might at a funeral, or a job interview, or a party. Gathering material, if you need to gather material. And for your autobiographical speech, I doubt you need to do any research, though. If you always wanted to interview family members about family history or genealogy, or even do a little bit of genealogical research on your own, you're certainly free to do that. Though I suspect that you already have all of the information you need for your autobiographical speech. That's done deliberately, especially in such a condensed class as this one. Making the speaking outline, which we'll talk about in depth over the next few classes. Practicing, and then of course delivering the speech. So the third chapter was about critical listening. And if I needed to summarize the third chapter, it's basically we are very poor listeners. And there is a difference between hearing, which is processing sound, and listening, which is paying attention. And most individuals can hear, assuming that they don't have a physiological reason why they can't hear. But listening, paying attention, is a completely different thing. And of course, you want to pay attention to the speeches of your peers, much like you want them to pay attention to your speech. There are multiple barriers to paying attention. Something that you probably know of as daydreaming is called the internal perceptual field. Basically means that our thoughts move more quickly than what we can hear when someone is speaking. So we begin to think our own internal world. And before you know it, we've missed a piece of what the individual has said, or all of what the individual has said. There is a reason why students are encouraged to take notes, and I encourage you to take notes of these videos. The reason why is because it keeps you on task to listen so that you're less likely to daydream. And you know how one idea leads to another and leads to another, and before you know it, you are completely off task. There is something also called the external perceptual field. That's the environment. It could be something like noise, or it could be something like lighting, or it could be something like temperature. And sometimes you can control these things. For instance, if you have poor lighting when you are recording your speech, definitely you want to be able to control that to improve the lighting so we can see you. Sometimes you can't necessarily improve things. If you've ever been in an in-person class with the teacher continually opening and closing the door, they're probably trying to control the external perceptual field, whether it be temperature or noise from the outside or both. And asking yourself questions when you're listening to speeches. There's a speech rating handout in the syllabus and documents section that I'm going to be reviewing in the future. It's actually the template I'm going to be using to review your first speech. After the first speech, I don't even use that template. I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But this will give you an idea of what it is that you need to do to put together a speech, and how it is you could evaluate the speeches of your peers, as well as how I'm going to be evaluating your own speeches. It's basically a summary of what's coming up in the chapters that we will be discussing. So in terms of the textbook itself, in Chapter 2 on Getting Started, there's a great visual for getting started. I'm not sure which edition you're using, so I'm not sure what page number you might find it on. But it is presented as a staircase because you are at step 1, selecting and narrowing the topic right now. And as we continue to move up that staircase with gathering material, making a speaking outline, and then finally finishing at the top of the staircase, delivering the speech. And our next class is going to be talking about Chapter 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7 is about organizing and outlining. Chapter 8 is about beginning and ending the speech. And all elements of the speech are important, but particularly the beginning and the ending. And Chapter 9 is about language, wording the speech. So, you may or may not have noticed that when I was reviewing the Toastmasters video, I left out one important element that was discussed in the video. And that that element in the video was about nervousness. That everybody feels nerves when they are presenting to others, especially to peers. In fact, some studies have even shown that some people fear public speaking more than they fear death, which I think is absolutely remarkable. For most people, I think death is about as bad as it gets. But nevertheless, I thought we may as well address the elephant in the room in our discussion forum question about nervousness. Now, the Toastmasters video gave you some suggestions on how to deal with nervousness, and the textbook gives you some suggestions on how to deal with nervousness. But my suspicion is that you have your own approaches or perhaps techniques that you can recommend for approaching nervousness as well. So that's today's discussion forum question, which would be due Saturday, the 22nd of July at 9 a.m. Again, if you need an extension, please let me know. What suggestion or suggestions do you have to control nervousness, and why? And again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you an idea of the class discussion that we would have if we were meeting. And this counts as your attendance. It's not evaluated in any way outside of the fact that you have completed that discussion forum response. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing as well as I can with my cold. Hopefully I will be in a better situation next class. And we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.